absolute pleasure and privilege to introduce my very good friend. We've been friends for 25 years now, so it's been a long time, but Richard McGregor. So Richard is Emeritus Professor of Music at the University of Cumbria. He completed a PhD on the music of Peter Maxwell and studied with Donatoni in Italy in the early 1980s. Richard has published widely on the music of James Macmillan and Wolfgang Green, and he writes and speaks on music and spirituality, agency, identity, creativity and inspiration. However, he is of course more widely known for his work on the music of Peter Maxwell Davies, and Richard has written a number of major articles on Davies's compositional techniques of the 1980s, the composer's use of plain song and other source material, the ballet Salome, parody pastiche in Davies's music, on the decoding of Max's personal alphabet, which we will all be forever grateful, and on Mr. Emmett Takes a Walk. His most recent publication, which appeared in 2020, is the co-authored book, The Music of Peter Maxwell Davies. Without further ado, and not to embarrass him anymore, over to you, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Remind me to tell you someday the story of McDonald's and cracking the code in 2000. I'm not going to read Max's diary entries necessarily, and we are all musicians, we can multitask, so I'll be talking to these in some cases. What I hope to show in this keynote is how Max's ideas for music theatre and opera works were formed and developed over time, rather than, for the most part, trying to analyse the results. It's a pity that Max's works, which ally music and theatre, should be so dominated by 8 songs for Mad King and The Lighthouse. Certainly those two works, in their own ways, demonstrated his ability to manipulate the theatrical and musical elements into an effective whole, despite the criticisms which have been labelled at both, although in fact most criticism of Max's theatrical works focused on the shortcomings of the libretti that he wrote himself up to the time of Resurrection. This was Joseph Kerman's principal gripe with the opera Taverner, who he wrote, "It's a rather marvellous score, that rather less marvellous as a theatre piece, due to some errors in dramaturgy." Again, hardly unexpected when a composer with notes insists on doing someone else's professional work. I know what Maxwell thought of that. In 1964, a number of composers had gathered together at the Wardour Castle Summer School, during which there was a forum on opera today. According to Michael Hall, the composer Anthony Gilbert, who was born in 1934, attacked the status of traditional opera in the 20th century. And the general discussion that ensued eventually led to a consensus among the composers present as to what music theatre, as they defined it, should include and exclude. Of perhaps even more significance, though, was the iconic and electrifying performance of Pierrot Lunaire, given by Bethany Beardsley with the Melos Ensemble, conducted by Edward Downes, towards the end of the 1965 summer school. Growing out of these experiences, Max drew a clear distinction between different types of work which combined theatre and music genres, opera, masque, music theatre. As quite a young man, he'd already formulated a clear idea of what his life's work would be in terms of opera. In this diary entry from 1974, he writes, as you can see, when he wrote that, he was looking back to a time when he was already perhaps 7 years into the composition of Taverner. It says a lot about Max as a composer that at the age of just 22, he was already thinking about such a major undertaking as an opera. His 1957 diary entry, probably written from its context at the end of April or the beginning of May that year, doesn't just say, "I have a wonderful idea for an opera, this will be called Taverner, and will concern itself with the life of John Taverner," but continues with a further 5 pages in which the whole opera is sketched out in scene-by-scene detail. As you'd expect, the first idea did not become the final version, and there isn't time here to expand at length on all that's written in the diary, but I do want to highlight a number of details which will resonate forward to subsequent works, some of which I'll mention in due course. Taverners on trial for Lutheran heresy in front of Cardinal Wolsey, a jury of 12, and 2 lawyers, one of whom is a female cat in a legal wig. Why a cat is not clear, and the cat didn't make it to the final version, but does appear in Resurrection 30 years later. Below the lawyers is a Marionette Theater, and the witnesses, I put those in inverted commas, appear there, their parts sung by the lawyers, except for Taverner's wife and the priest, while the lawyers also pull the strings. There are no puppets in the final version, but in Resurrection, the main character is a puppet who's controlled in another way, and we'll come back to that later. The puppets here include Taverner's muse, his parents, the ghost of his posthumous reputation, and inanimate objects, a mirror, for which I quote, on the psychological consequences of a physical object, brackets, his nose, in brackets, and his diary. One wonders if Max had in mind Gogol's story, The Nose here, although the diary slightly later refers to Kafka. The diary suggests that even at this stage, Max was considering the dance possibilities of what he'd just written, and I'm struck with the fact that Max was already thinking, albeit obliquely, about something that would bother him through his whole life, his posthumous reputation. The second scene takes various images and alters them. The Virgin Mary becomes Taverner's wife. Taverner himself is Christ crucified. The jury are replaced by wire statues with cardboard faces and false noses, quote, to suggest reformed men, women, and animals. That's an early example of Max exploring aspects of what is real and what is not real. There are a couple of interesting comments attached to the third and fifth scenes, which are worth noting. In the third scene, a servant is half sleeping, half waking in between King Henry and the Cardinal. He wakes up occasionally and sings something irrelevant to the issue about his loves or what have you. Symbolism, obvious. The scene 5 notes make direct reference to Joyce's Ulysses, which Max read as a teenager, and informs scenes, as Nick has observed, in Revelation and Fall, Missa super l'Armée, and that these references persisted into the final version was noted by David Beard, who observed that the citations lifted from Ulysses are embedded in the libretto of the opera Taverner. And John Warnaby suggested that the advert sequences in Max's Resurrection might have been stimulated by Ulysses. In this early draft, Max relates it to Taverner, this is quote again, Taverner's conversion, giving up of music, betrayal of 4 friends. The idea of the whole scenario and the meaning being turned on its head is suggested by the description of the second scene of the second act. The cardinal, executed, becomes Archbishop Cranmer, and the work is to end with Taverner singing, quote, stupid popish ditties, end quote, while music which he wrote for a mass, originally heard in Act 1, sounds underneath. Now, less than 2 months after writing that, Max attended a performance of Berlioz's opera Benvenuto Cellini, which made a deep impression on him, not least some of the images which were created for that production, and which, it's clear, he subsequently repurposed for his own use. In his 1957 diary, he observes these. Now, I'm not going to read them out. I'm going to let you just look at it. The comment about Berlioz is Max's. If you know Taverner, you'll realise some of these things are already there. That this opera had a great impact on Max is obvious. Some of you will know Taverner in depth. David wrote about it some years ago for the Maxwell Davies Studies volume. This next slide that I'm about to show you contrasts a scene from Benvenuto Cellini with a selection of Act 1, Scene 2 of Taverner as described by Paul Griffiths. I'm not sure where rerum creator came from. In Benvenuto Cellini, the monks sing to the Virgin Mary, and on the face of it, there's no hymn rerum creator in the opera's libretto. Though, and I'm not sure if this is significant, the words rerum creator begin the second line of the Latin hymn Te lucis ante terminum. The earliest reference I can find from Max using Te lucis ante terminum is a sketch dated 25th August 1959. I've spent some time on this early form of taverna because it is so important to help us to contextualize a number of Max's subsequent, what we might almost characterize as obsessions. Taverna, as a work in progress, only appears sporadically in the diaries over the next 4 years, almost always just saying that it has to be done. However, there is one interesting diary entry which shows that the idea of resurrection, or rather false resurrection, was already part of Max's thinking in 1961. The diaries stop in 1961 and don't pick up again till 1973. Chris Austin asked Max why there are no diaries for those years, and Max replied, "It's all in the music." Considering that Max would call these, for the rest of his life, the terrible years, right through to the end of his life, this seems a rather disingenuous reply. Since the early diaries particularly have pages that have been removed, presumably by Max, but not certainly, and stuff scored out, it's quite possible that he destroyed the diaries for those missing years. Among other things we do know from that period is that while he was in America, he made a road trip with the Mansfields, both of whom subsequently carved out distinguished careers. In fact, Avril Mansfield, she retained her first married name professionally, is a particularly well-known figure, having become the UK's first female professor of surgery. As a participant on Desert Island Discs in October last year, she included the inevitable work by Max. It seems more likely that during that road trip and the various conversations, Max actually conceived the idea of the surgical operation, which is performed on the dummy in Resurrection, and about which he wrote to Donald Mitchell in September 1963. Now, as an aside, Avril and Max met on the Queen Elizabeth, which arrived at New York on the 25th of September 1962. And Avril commented on that meeting in the edition of Desert Island Discs. The only people who turned up for the food. But I remember, this is interesting, that phrase. At one point, he said he was going to write an opera about the operating theatre with me in it. I don't remember if he ever did. I don't think she was in it, but I think there was an operating theatre. There's plenty of commentary around the works of the late 60s, so in the absence of any composer-generated material, there's little point in going over what has already been said. Except to say that as he got older, Max not only lost interest in H songs, but actually his writing about it shows a degree of aggravation. Even as early as 1974, when writing about the music theatre and other key works, and the reflection in them of the Antichrist in himself, he doesn't reference it. I'm going to read this one. I realised that my being alone first in Princeton, then in Tollard Royal in Wiltshire between 62 and 64, enabled me to come to living terms with the shattering upheaval which broke through the veneer of my attempts to interpret sound images in terms of Christ, the Virgin Mary, etc., and forced me to take account of the Antichrist in myself, resulting in years of darkness from which hymnos, revelation and fall, l'homme armé, and probably, though late, world's bliss were the eventual surface manifestations, as well as the opera. We're all aware of the number of times that the Antichrist figure appears in Max's dramatic works. But it's interesting to speculate why he should apply that designation to himself. We have to assume that the vision of 3 operas, which we saw earlier, also found in the same diary as this quote here, would mean that other musico-dramatic works that he wrote would inevitably be differently characterized, hence music theatre and masque. Blind Man's Buff is described as a mask, and although it's an opera, Max also used that word in connection with Resurrection. Interestingly, all the children's stage works after Cinderella are described as music theatre. Such general background as I have time to give here doesn't articulate all the underlying and recurring themes and interlinkings which are found in most of his stage works, excluding those for children, some of which explore environmental issues with which he became more concerned in later life. It's well known that his obsessions were with the nature of betrayal, either as a fact or as a result of some disturbance of the mind, and from that, the question of what is real and what is not real, or perhaps what is false. He himself was often troubled, and the diaries show this clearly, particularly about the relevance of his work. And he did suffer from periods of self-doubt, almost depression, often at the end of a decade. What is perhaps not so well known is that his determined anti-clericism, which surfaces in a number of places in the stage work in some form or another, was already there, although you might easily guess it from Missa super l'homme armé. Some of his anti-clericism, and probably the fear of betrayal, I would think were connected to the dangers around his sexuality at the time. So I want to go directly to Blind Man's Buff. Although it's short and not particularly well known, the fact that it appeared at the end of that period that Max called the terrible years gives it, I think, a special significance. And I apologise if some of the section is familiar to some of you who were at the Max Day in Canterbury 3.5 years ago, because it's derived from that. Writing to Gerald McBurney, the same letter that Nick quoted in 1991, Max remarked that Blind Man's Buff is a seminal work in many ways. The work, he says, is about identity crisis expressed through mask imagery. I think Nick quoted that today. And I enjoy wearing masks. You can make otherwise impossible statements behind a mask. Blind Man's Buff is described as a mask, M-A-S-Q-U-E. Written not long after he made the indication or decision to move to Orkney. And it's almost certainly to be interpreted at least having some personal biography hidden within its pages. Max admitted in an interview with Tom Sutcliffe in 1972, the year of Blind Man Buff's completion, that it took a while for the imagery of the work to come together. Max once said to me that when I sent him photocopies of the violin part book of the Victorian Coleman, William Tilsley, which contained at the very end of the book the tune for Swinton Jig, that he might well use it in 5 years' time. So we have to remember that Max took some time to process and synthesize ideas over years, 23 in the case of Resurrection. Blind Man's Buff is no exception. Understanding Max's composition processing period is something that needs further study. Even a short work like Blind Man's Buff had a gestation period. It was not the case that Max only became aware of Buchner's Leonce and Lina, on which the work is based, when he came to write the work. Sketches in the British Library collection show that he was already aware of the Buchner as early as 1965-6, when working on Revelation and Fall. In Revelation and Fall, sketches are the sketches for a song using the text of Rosalia's song from Act 3 of Leonce and Lina, O meine müde Füße. Reference to this song occurs again in 1968 in the sketches for Missa l'homme armé, which incidentally was revised for publication in 1971. These two works and Blind Man's Buff have specific connections, either overt or hidden, with the idea of false resurrection. False or pantomime resurrection Max would take to its logical or perhaps illogical extreme in the music theatre work Resurrection. I'm grateful to Peter Owens, who almost 30 years ago, when discussing the status of works written by Max in the 60s and 70s, noted that the amount of sketch material for Blind Man's Buff suggested that it was a more important work than its brevity implied. As it turns out, that observation was particularly well justified. Blind Man's Buff shares a number of key dramatic characteristics with other works of the period, in particular, the presence in the dramatis personae of the boy king and the jester. So, in Blind Man's Buff, the boy king is resurrected, but in Max's own words, it's a false resurrection. Second, there's the figure of the jester, who is a resurrected character from Taverner, given its first performance in 1972. So the opera was almost certainly in his mind as he was writing Blind Man's Buff, whose first draft score dates from March that year, with his first performance in May. In the opera, the jester removes his mask to reveal himself to be synonymous with death, which you'll remember is the implied end in 8 songs, the actual end of Magnus in Martyrdom of St. Magnus, and the lighthouse keepers in the lighthouse. Max gives the jester 3 identities: singer, mime, and dancer, so it's not clear which is the actual character, hence his comment about masks. Which is the real character? 10 years after writing Blind Man's Buff, and in conversation with Paul Griffiths, Max said that the piece is perhaps, and quote, one of the tightest expressions of this whole preoccupation with what is real and what is not real, what is meant and what is parody, and what exactly is parody. Perhaps this was a good place to give 2 illustrations of how Max embodies this idea of falseness in the music of Blind Man's Buff. So, an example. Near the beginning of the work, the boy king asks the jester, "Who are you?" The jester's response is an alternating pair of set statements which are swapped between the voice and the flute, as seen here, to the words, "Am I this or am I that?" The set forms used do not just express the jester's words by being neither one thing nor the other, they also have a level of meaning which is perhaps less obvious. One set is the prime form transposition 0, more or less a rising scale, and while the paired set is the same but at transposition 6, in other words, the tritone. Thus, the suggestion is implicit that the jester is the devil by way of a false dominant, and the whole tone connection suggested can link to the so-called death chord, that which we've already had today. There is one form of set manipulation which occurs in this work. A transformation set where the prime set is transformed by 10 steps into its retrograde by way of a single pivot. Once again, the transposition set links to the jester's statement, "Am I this or am I that?" Since the prime starting pitch is F, the pivot pitch, B, is again the tritone. The jester's next statement, Max, is taken from the Buchner original. "Verheftig ich bekomme Angst. Ich könnte mich so ganz außen anders scheren und blättern." And Max rendered it as, "It scares me to think how easily I can be peeled and segmented." That must surely have been a gift of a text to a composer with Max's permutational proclivities. The segmentation is found throughout the work, even in the setting of the nursery rhymes, which punctuate the action. As you can see from this example, my pencil lines are on the printed version. The vocal line is made up of pitch row segments, and incidentally, not always what it's expected, accompanied by ukulele and banjo, instruments that Max had used in his orchestrations of The Boyfriend in 1971, brought in here in a quasi-comical way. He'd use a similar approach to Blaze's song in Part 2 of The Lighthouse in 1977. Now, it's possible that Max here is making a parody on contemporary musical practice. He certainly did that with the offstage band in Resurrection, finished in 1987. That might explain partly why he says to Griffiths that this work was the tightest expression of what is meant by parody and what exactly is parody. But what about the possible interpretation of peeling in relation to pitch selection processes in work? This example, as it seems, contains many isolated horizontal dyads, which are often minor third intervals. There's nowhere in the sketches any set thematic derivation for this. However, there is some indication in the sketches that Max was playing around with pitch content of the set complex by taking isolated dyads out of individual set statements. Thus, a pair might come from set statement 2, while a later pair from set statement 4, but without the intervening pitches used. That's perhaps as near as I can get to an explanation of this passage, which was apparently originally set to the text "you" or "I," from the recapitulation section, which Max apparently later brought forward to the opening instrumental section without text and termed Erstes Zwischenspiel. That's first interlude. And typically for Max, 8 bars long. We often find that annotation middle 8 written in his personal alphabet, and they are 8 bars long. The set statements in the interludes and at you or I in the recapitulation are, I'd suggest, deliberately made vague and difficult to define in order to express in musical terms that ambiguity of the work's identity narrative. Of course, much of this reflection on symbolic gestures in the work relies on the assumption that Max's intention was to create these levels of meaning. We know that he was not only heavily influenced by medieval symbolism, but in later works, he clearly intended symbolic gestures to be understood as contributing to the meaning of the work. So writing to McBurney, he talks of a whole network of cross-references in the music which add meaning, ambiguity, and contradiction. There is, I feel, quite an important extra musical connection with alchemy which surfaces in this work. I would perhaps suggest that Max was thinking about the material in John Mitchell's work, The View over Atlantis, which Rodney referred to. And Gillian Whitehead lent that book to him around the time. She was already using magic squares, and she showed him a piece which used them. I couldn't find out from her which one it was. I don't think she can remember. And she says that his comment was, "You even made me think." As is now well known, this book was the source of the magic square idea, which he was soon to adopt. But we should not lose sight of the fact that the book also explored alchemical matters, like the squares, not in great detail, but I guess enough to pique Max's interest. In this letter to McBurney, Max says that the music, Blind Man's Buff, contains constant processes of transformation at all levels, micro to macro, and the use of symbols, in the brackets, chords, rhythmic figures, fragments of melody, close the bracket, for what I think of as equivalents of alchemical elements. And although I can't prove it as an alchemical origin, I'd suggest that the fact that Mitchell chose to place his discussion of magic squares in the context of a discourse on mathematical relationships found or said to be found in the pyramids, again, Rodney referred to that this morning, could well have influenced Max in his construction of the pitch pyramid you see here. I hadn't identified any plainsong origin for Blind Man's Buff when I contributed the appendix to Nick and Ken's studies book. But you'll see that Max has added OMM on the left-hand side. It doesn't take much effort to work out that this is O Magnum Mysterium, the plainsong which Max used several times in the 60s and 70s, and not just in that work written in 59-60. As an aside, Michael Channon, in his article on the Opera Taverner, suggested, perhaps inaccurately, that the appearance of God the Father in bars 503 to 8, singing Ecce Filios Bastardus Meus, is, he says, the first appearance of parody in Max's music, suggesting it's a parody of Max's own O Magnum Mysterium. But there's more here. You see on the right-hand side, IS. This is Igor Stravinsky. Stravinsky died on the 6th of April 1971, and the summer issue of Tempo contained a series of canons in memoriam Stravinsky, including one by Max. As it turns out, the pyramid shape from here, from Blind Man's Buff, and the canon are one and the same, except that the canon's in the bass clef. And it's now part of the interest which attaches to Blind Man's Buff that we should consider that, at least in part, a realization of Max's canon in memoriam Stravinsky. Blind Man's Buff is actually full of symbolic alchemical gestures. Max has the chests of the dancer on the mine emblazoned with alchemical sun and moon symbols. Let's not forget the squares of the sun and the moon here. And the resurrection of the king is realized by a large banner on poles depicting the spirit. The score specifies that the end is a kind of alchemical wedding. The king abdicates in favor of the masked newlyweds, the prince and princess, the mime and the dancer. And talking with Tom Sutcliffe before its premiere, he recalls it It's a rather strange work, playing identities. It's got alchemical overtones as well, the transformation process of dross into gold, which goes wrong. At the end is another false resurrection, very grotesque. The other element is the text is nursery rhymes, which have got a very funny feel about them because they're so innocently sinister. There's an indication in a 1974 diary from around the time of the first performance of Nach Bergamo that Mach was getting closer to the idea of magic squares, but was still formulating his thinking about them. This quote, which is part of a much longer one, I'll put it up so you can read it while I'm talking about it, is the first indication that I've found so far of Mercurius, appearing in the diaries. Now, you probably know that eventually Max would use the 8x8 magic square of Mercury in A Mirror of Whitening Light in 1978. He's referring to the various journeys he's made both at home and abroad. I didn't bother putting that bit in. He talks about various places that he's been to, some very local, some far away. That the ideas contained in Blind Man's Buff were never totally abandoned by Max is shown by their reappearance in 1991, the year of Max's letter to Gerald McBurney, so clearly in his mind. In connection with the Flute Concerto, also known as Strathclyde Concerto No. 6, which is based on Bruegel's picture Children's Games, Max says it's based on a passage from Blind Man's Buff, and related, as Max observes, to parody, and as Max's letter to McBurney suggests, also to masks. Nobody's yet worked out what Max means by that in Strathclyde 6, by the way. I suggested earlier, perhaps, that there were two reasons to be interested in this work. The first being that Max considered it a seminal work in many ways. In that respect, I hope I've begun to suggest reasons in terms of Max's compositional technique as it was changing and developing, and why this might be a work to pay even more attention to than I have here. My second reason is my contention that there could be something biographical or personal to the composer contained within its pages. The very fact that he chose to revisit the O Magnum Materium set structure, and possibly the fact of it relating to Igor Stravinsky through the canon written that year, is one element. It's, however, the nature of the subject that is perhaps most interesting. The idea of masks, the concealed identity, are particularly striking in this and other works, though masks were by no means the sole preserve of Max at the time. And as an extension of this, his apparent obsession with the figures of the jester and the king, as well as the notion of false, pantomime resurrection, and the Antichrist figure. Paul Griffiths remarked that the king and the jester are both images of the artist, who may consider himself the king, creating and ruling his own realm of imagination, or the jester, who's a paid entertainer, but who equally has the power to overturn and question accepted meaning. Blind Man's Buff may be an expression of this dichotomy, but it's also a continuation of Max's obsession with the nature of betrayal. In Blind Man's Buff, the king is tricked into abdicating, or rather into killing himself only to be resurrected as a ghost. Following Griffiths, we could suggest that the composer is showing in this work that it's the function of the artist to create meaning. In this case, the key question is to ask, how can one distinguish the real from the not real? And what's the actual nature of reality anyway? In many ways, Blind Man's Buff is a much more subtle work than its predecessors, Revelation Fall, 8 songs, Missa l'Homme Armé. In all these works, religion and identity are confronted head-on, and the results are deliberately shocking and controversial. Blind Man's Buff, on the other hand, shows us Max synthesizing the ideas found in the earlier music theatre works and the opera, and it's clearly not the last word he would have on the subject. The nature of the workings of the mind, what he refers to as polarities of states of mind in his letter to McBurney, betrayal, and the victim permeate his stage works, all of them, in some way. Eight Songs was a runaway success, not least because it fueled the challenge to contemporary attitudes to madness, and the idea of the mind betraying an individual will appear in Max's opera and music theatre works from then on, in varying forms, from the power-crazed madness of Hakon in the opera Martyrdom of St. Magnus, the religious mania of Arthur, which calls forth the beast in the lighthouse, to the multi-personalities of the medium. Of these last, only the medium for solo soprano is described as a work of music theatre, but that constant thread runs through them all. Any one of those works could be a focus for the rest of this keynote, but with the possible exception of the medium, they're pretty well known. Miss Donnithorne might benefit from greater analysis, although there's a really helpful paper by Alan Williams on madness in the music theatre works, and of course there's Upa's thesis as well. That's partly the reason I've decided to focus the second part of this keynote on the number 11 bus and Resurrection, which are probably less well known. A bit of background is needed for the number 11 bus. It was written in 1984. Mike Seabrook's brief mention of the work includes the fact that this was the work which caused the final breakdown in the relationship between the Fires and John Carew, whom Max had appointed principal conductor of the Fires in 1980. The work was not particularly well received, as these words from Stephen Johnson's review indicate. I think Peter and I were talking about it earlier. I think fatally obscure is probably an interesting. And even Mike Seabrook says, the work's a character piece where individual performers play various roles. Now, I know Upa mentioned it earlier. The same individual playing multiple roles is common in Max's music. For example, as we heard, the three relief lighthouse keepers also play the three keepers stuck in the lighthouse, and the performers take multiple roles in the Martyrdom of St. Magnus, and later also in Mr. Emmett. And it's usually assumed that Max developed the idea of multiple roles for an individual to keep costs down. But Robert Adlington points out that Birtwistle was already used this idea in Monodrama in 1967, which takes its model, this is a quote, which takes its model from the earliest form of Greek tragedy, in which one actor assumes numerous dramatic functions. On one level, the number 11 bus is simply a study, though exaggerated, of the various characters encountered on the journey of the actual number 11 bus from Liverpool Street to Hammersmith in London, a journey which I fortunately have never made. But according to Max's performing notes in the score, it's an apocalyptic comedy. John Warnaby, in his 1980 review of the first performance, commented perceptively that this character study was clearly in part a preparation for the opera Resurrection, which was completed 3 years later, in both being anti-clerical and in containing events which anticipated the later work, such as the long-faced resurrection, that's a quote, when the tramp awakens from sleep. Another anticipation of the later work are the references to popular songs, and particularly rock music. In the later work, a rock group features prominently. Number 11 bus looks back towards the lighthouse in its use of the tarot as a thematic transformation determining agent. In the score, Max writes this. In the lighthouse, Max had used the tarot cards to create the structure and thematic content through the use of the magic square of Venus, that's 7 by 7. Presumably something similar happens in this work. I haven't had a chance to look at it in that depth yet. The figure of death, which has been so prominent in his opera Taverner and in Blind Man's Buff, and by implication in the lighthouse, through the tarot cards, returns to stalk the bus. Several other ideas in the work have their origins in earlier music theatre related works. The musicians dress in costumes as passengers on the bus, and Max remarked that, quote, the instrumentalists, often enjoy it very much, once they overcome their initial reluctance. Harking back to Blind Man's Buff, the score also calls for two dancers and a mime. Concerning the latter, Max is quite specific that he, sick, will need great flexibility and talent to make people laugh. This is almost certainly a reaction to the issues he had with the mime Mark Furneaux, And so the mime artist chosen for the first performance was Simon McBurney, brother of the composer, Gerald. The dancers in particular objectify the dichotomies which pervade the work: sun, moon, faith, idolatry, chastity, lust, patience, wrath, prudence, folly. The various symbolic strands are encapsulated in the titles of the movements, as for example, number 3, the High Priestess and the Hanged Man, with faith and idolatry. The sketches for the work don't show or suggest what magic square, if any, is being used in the work, but there's clear references to the plain chant Confirma hoc Deus, quod operatus es in nobis, a tempo sancto tuo, quod est in, and instead of Jerusalem, it's Hammersmith. Liber Iualis, page 869, if you want to find it. O Lord, confirm what you have done to us from your holy temple, which is in Hammersmith. To signify the false resurrection, but also to invoke a clear parody of the biblical book of Revelation. At this point in the action, the mime enters as the cardinal. It's only obvious from the sketches that Max's intention here is to underscore the notion of false resurrection through the generating plain chant. The plain chant continues, omitting the Alleluia in Max's text abbreviations into Gloria, P, Patri, that is, and F, Filio, and SP, Spiritua, S, Sancto, which is actually the chant for the following Psalm 67. So also in the Liber Iualis, page 869. But the plain chant is therefore false, since the original continues with the Alleluia. The top line of the cello's triple and quadruple stopping is the plain chant, and other chant references are buried within the rest of the texture, as you might see from there. Since Max wrote his own words and Stein's directions for the number 11 bus, there might be significance in the opening words. Light, still uncertain, waning moon, when you can't make out what's real or a ghost in the gloom, from out of your own head. Following these words, the mime gets up and is bedazzled by the growing light. Now that could be a back reference to Blind Man's Buff and the lighthouse, which we heard this morning, makes use of blinding light as key points. The reference to the moon might be conscious or unconscious gesture towards the work's musical origins in Pierrot Lunaire. But it's the second sentence which is most significant and clearly makes direct references to Max's obsession with the real and the not real, the power of the mind to invent and to deceive. It's a line that could apply equally to all Max's remaining music theatre works for professional performers. So, we come to Resurrection. Benvenuto, welcome. It's perhaps revealing that Resurrection represents a sort of culmination of Max's anti-clerical and religious obsessions. The Antichrist, false resurrection, and even what is real and what is not real. It was the last major music theatre work for which he wrote the libretto, but he did continue to write the libretto for children's works. And these show, as I said before, an increasing concern for environmental issues rather than religious ones. Resurrection was partly written during that difficult period between the deaths of his mother and his father. In fact, its completion was delayed. As I suggested, this work carries many of the characteristics of music theatre, those works which preceded it, although it's an opera, as we know, right back from the very beginning. Some of its parodying of apocalyptic preaching is undoubtedly closely related to ideas explored in the number 11 bus. Max might well have called this music theatre had he not conceived that specific idea of an opera with the title in 1963 while he was in America. Not only is it another anti-clerical opera, but it's also a diatribe against commercialism. Some critics seemed to want to view the work as having a message that was already 20 years out of date, despite the fact that commercialism and apocalyptic religious sentiments were perhaps even more pernicious when it was performed in 1987 than when Max conceived the work. There are other reasons why the work might be out of time. To understand the significance of these, you need to understand the plot. Now, if you don't know it, I've actually got a summary of it here. I'm not going to read it clearly, But I'll just carry on talking, and you can see what it says. Although conceived in 1963 while in America, even before that, Max did not really begin to draft material of Resurrection in detail until the early 80s. From answers he gave to Paul Griffiths, who interviewed him in February and May 1980, it seems that he must have started work on it immediately after he finished The Lighthouse. I'd already mentioned that in America, Max was intending to see brain surgery and heart-lung operations, particularly inside the heart, as preparation for a work set in the operating theatre. That's quote. So in Resurrection, as Max eventually conceived it, 4 surgeons removed the dummy's brain, that's his intellectual life and his political history, his heart, emotional and religious history, and his genitals, his sexual proclivities. For these reasons. It's quite clear, and we saw it already in relation to Taverner, that Max would take a musical or theatrical idea which he encountered and reuse or recycle it into his own work. So such was the case, for example, with Cinderella. I'm sure that had its origins in Max's attendance in December 1976, which is in the diary for 76, at a performance of a pantomime of the story created by Geoffrey King, his partner at the time, who was teaching at St Mary's Music School in Edinburgh. Similarly, the idea of puppets, a dummy and a Pierrot, can be traced back to Birtwistle's works, 3 Lessons in a Frame and Punch and Judy of 67-68. But there are other antecedents too. Michael Hall observed that Anthony Gilbert, Max's exact contemporary, who had been a pupil of, among others, Alexander Gurr, wrote a work called The Scene Machine, which was commissioned and first performed by the Staatstheater Kassel in April 1971, and subsequently the following March at Sadler's Wells by the New Opera Company. Although the work had its origin in stories that Gilbert made up while babysitting Gurr's children, Hall speculated that the conceptual idea behind it was Bertolt Brecht and Paul Hindemith's Das Badener Lehrstück vom Einverständnis, 1929-30, in which a large puppet is disembodied. The production of Gilbert's work suffered from difficulties with regard to the stage of the dummy's growth to monstrous size. Peter Hayworth offered a criticism of the production of Gilbert's work that it failed to provide the monstrous puppet figure who should serve as an embodiment of the spirit of musical commercialism. Gilbert remarked that even the Sadler's Wells production had great puppet problems, quote, at least once, ... embarrassingly, he says. For Resurrection, this could almost be history repeating itself, since Max's monster dummy suffered from similar setbacks in the first production, and Resurrection is about the stultifying effects of commercialism. Clearly, the concept was not apparently Max's own. And not only does Gilbert's piece have an expanding dummy, it also uses pop song pastiche, as does Resurrection. We don't know if Max had encountered either the Hindemith or the Gilbert work, but he might have seen the latter at Sadler's Wells Theatre. While it's conceivable that he knew neither, it's curious that in the case of Gilbert, that this was a composer very well known to Max, who had explored very similar ground to that which Max would explore a decade or so later in Resurrection. It would be very surprising if Max did not encounter Gilbert's work. And that's where a diary for 1972 would have given some answers. As well as Gilbert's work, there was also the music theatre piece Pantomimes by the younger composer Bruce Cole, a former pupil of Birtwistle. In Cole's work, there are 2 puppets with removable arms, legs and head, as well as one whose neck could extend 2 feet and one which a blown-up balloon head is blown up. In the course of the action, the messenger who announces the death of Harlequin tears apart the first small puppet, treating its head like a yo-yo, watches the clown hang the second puppet, and bursts the balloon serves as the third puppet's head. That work could easily have stayed in Max's mind while he was writing Resurrection, since not only did Max commission it, he also conducted its first performance by the Fires on the 12th of February 1972, and the revised version in 1975. The broad similarities between Cole's dismembered puppets and Max's modified dummy are, I'd say, too strong to be accidental. The first performance of Resurrection was something of a disaster. In Max's view, and it probably was, and he declared to Judy Arnold he'd never write another word for the stage again. In her memoir, Judy Arnold writes that what was wrong with the production. Now, there's quite a lot of text here. This will be available afterwards so you can see, and in any case, it comes from Judy Arnold's memoir, which is in Orkney Library. You can see, I'm going to be very quick on this. So there are 5 things that were different. In short, the work that Max intended to be full of black humour was completely worked in such a way for that first performance, which lacked any humour. At least a subsequent production did manage to correspond more to his original conception. The critic Roderick Dunnett, long a passionate advocate of Max's music, praised the 2001 Thalia opera production in Budapest, characterising the opera as an ultra-expressionist with the text hovering between Baroque Masque, Wozzeck and Audin's Paul Bunyan. The music, a kind of Hensian drollery, studded with brilliant allusion, Lutheran hymns, dance music, Steiner parody, grotesque pop. It's no mere bizarre medley, he says. It highlighted the tensions being enacted on stage where a normal child's adolescence is ritually buffeted and brutalised by the intrusions of school, the church, and the law into his very private world. I wonder if there's something of Max's childhood in that. We know what he thought of school, for example. Even though some critics believe that this opera was written 2 decades too late, what is clear is it represents a summary of Max's concerns and obsessions from the previous quarter century in its study of human attitudes, commercialism, anti-clericism, religious extremism. And as I just suggested, possibly ideas from his childhood and early adulthood. For those who don't know the opera, I just want to say a few words about it to help bring these thoughts together. Resurrection is structured around a series of mock television adverts, 24 in all, many of which are parody or paraphrase of popular styles for their effect. But given the fact the work is based on parodied TV commercials, it's rather ironic that Max was actually probably rarely exposed to these, and certainly not when he lived in Hoy. Equally, he rarely encountered popular music, and in many ways his pastiches of foxtrots were always more effective as he'd grown up with such music in his parents' house. According to the composer, the work uses 4 plain chants as its source material, and it might be significant that these included the plain chants, which he intended for use in the opera on Francis of Assisi, but was never written. Probably because Messiaen's Saint François d'Assise appeared in 1983. The plain chants were used again in the trumpet concerto, and which probably contains music which was originally intended for the St. Francis Opera. But as late as the 22nd of March 1986, Max worked on Resurrection, still working elementary basics, plain songs to be knocked into my head that I've not worked before. Such obvious stylistic parodies as occur in Resurrection never reappeared subsequently in Max's music, and it's likely that he said all he needed to say, and any use of parody thereafter reflected the older meaning of the term rather than being designed to mock. While he was working on the first draft of Resurrection, Max wrote in his diary, "Resurrection is the last roar, I should imagine, of the wild, instinctual wolfman of the 61 to 69, whose nature I wouldn't have encompassed had I not come here in 70 and slowly integrated it." Later in the same diary, while working on it, he speculates whether it might be his last work. He does that quite a few times, actually. And later, in May 1987, having finished the first draft, he wonders about its significance and future. I know it's commissioned by Darmstadt, and I'm expecting them not to put it on, and I'm sure I'll be lambasted for it. The final section, labelled The Song of New Resurrection, is as much a critique of a popular music style as it is of apocalypse-seeking Christianity. The music is to be heavy, hard, brutal, and the harmonic and rhythmic jagged edges emphasised. The drums to play ad-lib, heavy, heavy, he writes, double 40, and the mallets to keep a heavy and constant 16th note motion over an F minor pedal, which the singer sings a quasi-religious text. Towards the end of this section, between figures G8 and I8, the vocalist is required to shout, non-pitched, at what must surely be a quasi-echo of the performance of Pierre Lunaire by Bethany Beardsley at the Wardour Castle Summer School that started Max's music theatre evolution. Alchemical references occur throughout the work, and perhaps those associated with the sun and moon are particularly important, and a deliberate back reference to Pierre Lunaire. Resurrection represented a culmination of Max's development of the genre and his last engagement with both text and music for the professional stage. For all its shortcomings, this opera is above all the apotheosis of Max's social, religious, and psychological concerns, and a study of his musical legacy would certainly benefit from a deeper understanding of these creative, conceptual underpinnings. It's significant that Max didn't write his own libretti thereafter except for the children's works, nor did he return to the idea of the Antichrist in any subsequent work. His concern moved much more strongly, as I've said, to the effects of humans were having on the world, and the environment, and of course, later then the Iraq War. This became a feature of not only children's-centred works such as The Spider's Revenge, Turn of the Tide, The Hogboon, but also major works such as The Doctor of Midvi, written to Roberto by David Pumpney, and works such as the Antarctic Symphony, The Sorcerer's Mirror, and the Second Violin Concerto, Fiddler on the Shore. It's always difficult to know how to end something like this, so perhaps I'll leave the last word to Max. Having completed this 23-year journey and taken so long over it, he writes, but at least having the commission made me write it. Otherwise, I don't know, it's still impossible, impractical. A private celebration, notwithstanding, all by myself. I opened a bottle of Brunello di Montalcino, not 79. Look at the difference in his handwriting. Thank you. And just to finish up with, a bottle of 79. I'm afraid not, no. No, it was out of stock.
Wow, where do I start? I've got a number of questions here, but I certainly don't want to hog the floor. But what I do want to ask you said right at the start that Taverner seems to connect to the later works, and you've shown that, not necessarily musically, but all the ideas, it kind of woven through a sort of a lineage, I suspect.
Yeah.
8 songs, all those pieces from the late 60s, Old Man, Blind Man's Buff, Number 11 Bus, Resurrection. So you have that clear lineage. Do you think, listening to what you were saying about the 8 songs that Max was sort of indifferent even in 1974 to the piece, do you think that we now in 2021 need to shake off the influence of the 8 songs is it a problematic work for you because of that?
Not for me, no.
Who's it problematic for?
Well, I think you can't ignore it in terms of any discussion of music theatre. And some of what you've heard today is in an article which is in the German music theory, an article called Mind Games. And I don't talk about 8 songs other than just to mention a little bit in passing, trying to contextualise it. I think the important thing is, and that's what I was trying to do in there, was to actually contextualise it not just in terms of what Max was writing at the time, but what Birtwistle was doing and what Gurr was doing. And then, of course, more or less, Birtwistle abandons music theatre after Bow Down, and Gurr goes to opera, but not to music theatre. So Max is the sole exponent of music theatre, That makes jigsaws important because that means that it's kind of like his view of music theatre is shaped in part. There's things that come again, the musicians in cages, you know, dressed up, it comes back again, you know, in Number 11 bus in a different form, you know, and changing costumes, Number 11, the Lighthouse. There's things and the different personalities that emerge. The King's has several personalities in the thing. So we can't ignore it. We shouldn't ignore it. But at the same time, we've got to actually embed it within the totality.
I'm going to open the floor at this point. Have anybody got any questions they'd like to ask? Oh, Sally. Hello, Sally.
Hello. That was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, Sally.
But you just threw out a line which I was wondering about, that Sandy didn't write music theatre pieces.
Sandy didn't, no.
He did?
Well, yes, he did at the early stage, but after the opera, yes, I think he stopped. He was less into the idea of music theatre, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, I see. Sorry, after the opera.
Yeah, after the opera. Yeah.
I think actually it has been there all the way along, but perhaps expressed in different terms.
Yes. I mean,
I think music theatre has been a really basically for all three of them.
Yes.
Really.
I think it has to be because some of the ways in which music theatre was challenged certain conventions, certain ways of being, must inevitably have affected any dramatic work that went after it.
And not only dramatic.
Yes.
Yes.
Hello, Sylvia.
Do you think that's about the number of bus? I mean, I think the number of bus is terrific. And also, did you know that, I don't know whether you knew, because I can't hear everything everybody says, that the Cicantis were going to do an Italian version of the bus that goes from the Rome railway station to the where the boat is. Unfortunately, it went on for quite some time. Max was very keen on that. Unfortunately, they never got enough money, but it was very much a project, and I think that would have been terrific. I wish they'd done it. I would have liked to have seen that.
Peter and I were talking about the number 11 bus because apparently both of us were at the first performance. We didn't know each other at that point. It is a long time ago.
You avoided the question.
Yes, you avoided it. Okay, I'll get to you next.
Alex.
It might not really be a question of an answer, but I was just thinking about the themes that came up in this, and this kind of magical thinking that he kind of cultivated, or kind of what I think is a kind of medieval sort of mindset.
Yes.
And then this sort of anti-clerical, but it's about kind of reinscribing spirituality of some sort into life, or criticising commercialism. So I just wondered if there's anything, especially in his diaries, or maybe how it changed over time. Like, how did he think people should listen to his music? Because he talks obviously about how he writes his music a lot, but I just, what is his thoughts about the listener, in this kind of story?
I don't recall there being terribly many things about the reception. Clearly, it was not keen on what critics say. But there's, from the readings that I've done, I haven't really encountered any kind of expression of what he thinks of the audience. He's writing the music that he wants to write, but he doesn't really, it's not really concerned. But the critic can't say that because he doesn't actually say it.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, it's just it sort of stands to reason in a way from a certain sort of distance. If you're kind of criticising kind of like a kind of desacralisation, if you like, of sort of culture or something, that you might want to resacralise it for people. And is there a hope that this might provide a certain kind of experience for listeners and stuff?
I'm not sure. I think he was more concerned. About addressing what he felt on the inside and his feelings, because they're clearly quite complex in many ways. And there's a whole raft of things, some of which we can't explore yet.
interesting. You linked the influence of Mitchell's book to what Max was talking to earlier about in '91. It was still current in his mind. So you're actually tracing it back to that book, are you? Or does it go back even further?
Unfortunately, there's no reference to the book in the diary.
Yes. Yeah.
But there wouldn't be. And I tried to pin Gillian down as to when she would have given the book. And I'm not, she can't remember. But certainly she was using the idea of patterns and shapes and so on. So I think that Max will have got that idea from her.
Yeah.
Although, as you can see, she was already using patterns and shapes. So it really, you know, was sort of like mutually beneficial.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think what we'll do before we give Richard another round of applause, the time is 1:15. What I think we'll do is break now until 3:40, and then Sylvia will be. It's your moment, Sylvia, with your paper at 3:40. Okay. Wonderful. So one more time. So